second panel discussion, which is titled Moderate Islam, Reality or Myth. It's a very interesting title and very close to my heart. And I would love to listen everyone's remarks.
I would like to formally open this panel of dismantling global Islamic communist jihad. Welcome panelists, welcome audience to this great panel. The panel for now is Moderate Islam, Reality or Myth. Now, we live in times where we are confronted by increasingly frightening headlines telling us about massacres, showing us pictures of women who have acid thrown on their faces, women stoned to death, destruction of heritage, heavily veiled women who have remained anonymous for ages, with only a small window to look into the world. And we certainly see the Islamic State in the news a lot. Afghanistan, Syria, and India reported the highest number of terrorist attacks nationally in 2019. Overall, 2019 saw over 8,300 terrorist attacks worldwide and around 25,000 fatalities from terrorism. In 2020, Afghanistan ranked first on the Global Terrorism Index with a score as high as 9.59, making it the country that was most affected by terrorism on earth. However, we need to unpack the history and theology of Islam to understand the various nuances that need to go into the making of image of Islam as we have it now, and the image that is the correct picture of Islam.
Thank you so much. Sabse pehle, I would like to say my namaskar to everybody and wish you a very happy Ganesh Utsav. And today is Rishi Panchami also. So our Hindu Dharma, in our Shastra have enjoined upon us the duty of passing our, paying certain debts. So it's like, it's a Rishi Rin which you pay when you learn and when you spread that knowledge and carry that forward. So I'm very happy to be a part of this conference. Moreover, because I would like to actually congratulate all of us that we are actually already talking about it. Something, the elephant in the room, which people or the world refuses to see. Also, I was just reading some comments below when the other speakers were giving their, talking about what they felt, their opinions. A lot of people are asking, that they would want to hear certain things in Hindi. So I would try to, especially more so, because all such crimes are, against the Hindus, happening largely in India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and we are a Hindi-speaking belt. So they also need to know the real face, and that is why I'm talking about a little bit of the history. But I'll begin with where I come from. So I belong to this clan, which is a ferociously fearless clan of Khokars, which was the first line of defense against all the invaders, like whether it was Alexander, whether it was Ghazni, Ghori, Aibak, even Temur. And you'll be very happy to know that the people, the ones who killed Ghori also were Khokars. 20 of them entered the camp, the war camp, and entered his tent and killed him. There was this Jasrath Khokar also, who was a menace. He was the biggest danger for the, dangerous Kafir enemy of Timur and Mubarak Shah. So we also have mentions of them in Mubarak Shahi. Then even Khusro writes about them, that they were not annihilated and they were a constant troublemaker. These are the stories that I heard as a child. I grew up with these stories. And my grandfather, they were the residents of Rasool Jhelum, which is in Pakistan now, district Jhelum. And I grew up on the stories, those of the horror that they faced during the 1947. And these stories were mere representations of what millions of people in that belt, which is now Pakistan, faced of arson, loot, rape, murder, and we know it all. And the saddest part is that the biggest mass migration, the biggest Holocaust in the world history, actually finds no mention in the history books, one. And two, it did not happen overnight. It was the outcome of a long conspiracy of over 1,000 years. The worst part is that the Muslims still date, they actually exist in those same tribal times, and they still hallucinate eliminating the kafirs from the face of earth. So, abhi, thoda, I will try that I should, certain points I should put forth in Hindi. And why do they do that? Why do they exist? Because when we say a moderate Muslim or a soft or a peace-loving community, the fact of the matter is that it is the book that commands him to wage an unending war on the world to establish this theocratic state or the global Islamic state, which is a dream which was envisaged about 1400 years ago. So whether it was, from the Ghazwa-e-Badr till the present day Afghanistan, nothing has changed. They are absolutely clear about what they want. The SOP remains the same, and they harbor the same dream, the same intention, and the ruthless techniques also remain the same. We are absolutely aware of that. So a little bit of their history. I agree there are lots of books available. Lots of people have written huge, enormous material over them, but somehow it is not reaching, one. And another thing is that most people or the youth today isn't very keen on reading. Their attention spans are very short. So there has to be more material that has to come out, and everybody must be aware of it. It's the entire world. It is not just India that is facing that. So Islam basically is a political cult, that is absolutely clear. And this was established by a man who called himself the messenger and who forced upon his tribe to call him or accept him as a Rasul. This man, the first thing that he did was the first war that he waged was called Ghazwa-e-Badr, which was on the 17th day of Ramzan, which is the lunar calendar of the Jews. And this first war is called Ghazwa-e-Badr, and it is, he waged this, it was unprovoked, और ये था on his own cousin, the same family, the same Quraysh clan, who were very wealthy and also the custodians of Kaaba. So this was the first war, and this man in 8 years, that is 622 to 630, he waged about 64 such ghazwas. So why should the present day Muslims not emulate, or why should they not follow? Because the book has over 100 verses to convince a Muslim to do so. I'll just read a few. There's this verse 2.193, which says, Allah made jihad a binding duty for Muslims, whereby they must keep fighting until Islam becomes the sole religion of the earth. Another one, which is 911, which says, Allah has purchased the life of believers who must engage in jihad and slay and be slain, maro or maro, just to, and be constantly engaged in jihad, kyunki aapko ye karna hi hai, this is what your book says. Then Allah also commands all the Muslims to plunder the wealth of infidels in jihad. Aapko hak hai, adhikar hai, you can take their wealth. As sacred booty, Allah ne aapko kya diya hai? He's inherited you unseen lands, और वो lands जो आपने कभी नहीं देखे, and the lands, homes and money of the kafirs. This is verse 33.27. And 8.41 says, and out of the booty that you acquire, जो आप लूट में से इकट्ठा करते हो, उसका 1/5 share जो है वो अल्लाह ने assign किया है to the messenger, यानी the prophet himself. And ये जो मॉडल उसने बनाया था प्लंडर और इकोनॉमिक एक्सप्लॉयटेशन का, this is the most ideal example that all these Muslims emulate till date, and there is no two way about it. Jizya, Quran 20, the verse 9.29 says, Jizya shall be taken from the kafir. The economic model that I'm talking about should be taken with belittlement and humiliation. So, jo dhimmi hai, he's supposed to not come on a horse, he's supposed to walk, he's supposed to stand while the collector sits, and the collector is supposed to slap him after he's received it, and so on and so forth. That is 9.29. Now, this also is absolutely clear. It is there in the history, it is there in their memoirs, that Muslim rulers in India, for example, took about 50 to 75% jizya as, produce, the share of the produce as jizya, which was the land tax, which was called kharaj. And as recent as 1946, also in Noakhali, when they converted about 95% of the Hindu population, they took jizya from them. In 1920, they actually, during the Mufla riots, there was this man called Kunja Ahmad Haji who created a Sharia control state in the region of Kerala, and he also extracted jizya from the people. Or he also sold the Hindu women to Arabs. Now, what if these are the examples that we have? What is halal economics? That also happens to be, in my opinion, the same, absolutely same. Just the modus operandi remains the same. The face of it changes. Now, also the book wo bhi clearly state karti hai, the Prophet kept most beautiful women for himself. जो लूट में से बूटी में से उसका भी और जो बाकी थी he would उनको वो distribute कर देते थे to his the raiders, और किसी को जो और बचती थी they would sell them for horses, for weapons and all. So I will just read a couple of those also from his first biographer Ibn Ishaq, Tarikh-e-Tehri. He says, spoils of battle, including women and children, were divided among the Muslims as a part of his share. And he says, as a part of his share, Apostle selected Raina as part of his beauty. So he would also select the most beautiful women. And again, he says, Apostle sent Saad bin Ziyad al-Sari to Najd with women of Banu Qurayza, taken as captive after slaughtering their men in the market of Medina, and sold them for horses and weapons. So women were also sold for, they were also a tool for generating money. This never-ending war that they have imposed on the world, the barbaric, regressive cult. So I feel, or whatever I have understood, whatever I have read and studied, there is, no moderate, soft, or whatever Muslim or peaceful Muslim. A Muslim is a Muslim because he must live within the framework of Islam. And if he doesn't, he's a kafir. So he must abide by Sharia. Simple words mein agar kaha jaye, the Sharia is the law of Allah. He has to follow the book. और उसको सुन्ना कहते हैं, उसको जो prophet के deeds को emulate करना. He has to ape, he's supposed to ape and copy whatever the prophet did. That is why, and that is Sharia. और अगर वो Sharia follow नहीं करता, तो he's no more a Muslim, moderate or peaceful or whatever. So, couple of quotes from that, 24.42, 34.1, वो कहती है किताब के क्योंकि उसको किताब भी follow करना है, तो किताब कहती है कि heaven, earth and all on it belongs to Allah. Then 6.165 says, Allah made Muslims inheritors of the earth. And 2.55 says, He has promised Muslims to make them rulers of the earth. When the book is saying that, which moderate Muslim or a so-called peaceful Muslim would deny this? And if at all he says that it is misinterpretation. So let him only explain it to us. What do these verses mean? Let him come forward and say, no, this is not meant. This is not supposed to be this. And let him defy it. Let him stand up against it. Okay. So he's not a Muslim anymore if he does that. So people. Now, another example, people of all faiths would worship in the pagan shrine called Kaaba. So we also have his biographer, Ibn Ishaq. He's dedicated pages and is described how that was broken, how the Prophet himself, उसने कैसे सारे idols Kaaba में जो थे 360, उसने कैसे तोड़े, how they were broken, how they were burnt. Or kaise his son-in-law Ali stood on his shoulders to tear off the idol of their god called Hubal. So this also is absolutely clear in the book. Also by there are plenty of verses which have explained that too. Now, if I was to ask, if that is what he did, he broke that and he created the first mosque. Which moderate Muslim or which educated Muslim has ever objected to the breaking of anybody's place of worship, whether it was our Adityastan in Multan when Sindh and Multan fell, whether it was Ram Janmabhoomi, the Babri dispute, whether it is Kashi Vishwanath, whether it is the Bamia Buddha, who has stood up against it? किसने उसके बारे में खड़े होकर के बोला कि this is wrong? Who has condemned it? So again, I'm just trying to shatter or break in the whatever little given time that I have, all the, with facts and figures, all the impressions or all the ideas that you have of a moderate or a educated Muslim. There are n number of educated Muslims today. We know that very clearly, who are terrorists. Yeah. So huge population also of the Muslims, who are, I'm really sorry to say that, unfortunately, are a parasite on the progressive societies, and they are not educated, and they don't even wish to get educated. Why? Because the book says so. Another quote. The book says, the Quran 7.157 says, follow the prophet who can neither read or write. Then you have 8, 175 and 176, 26 and 224, which says, Bukhari 8.175 and 176, poetry and music is haram, 26 and 224. Art, music, poetry, architecture, science, luxury, etc. are categorically prohibited, 43.33 to 35, 6.32. Who, and another one, which is Bukhari 7.49, says, who thinks that musical instruments are lawful, whoever believe among them that the musical instruments are lawful, will be destroyed and transformed into pigs and apes. So can you believe it, that this, there is racial superiority? For example, the Turks, who consider themselves blue-blooded and who consider all the converts to be of low blood. And I will just read a little paragraph on how even they decided that the Muslims in India, when they were here, Ziauddin Barani in Tariq-e-Firoz Shahi writes that teachers of all kind are sternly ordered to teach nothing to the low-born dogs. वो कहता है इनको, अब you ask anybody, an educated Muslim, an uneducated Muslim, he will tell you, हम पे 3 चीजें फर्ज है, नमाज, रोजा and hajj. So exactly this is what is written there. He says, don't teach anything to these low-born dogs. Nothing more than the rules of namaz, roza and hajj were to be taught. And he says, unko khali important chapters of Quran padna sikhao, or inko, because these low-born dogs are capable of all vices, they are worthless and they are shameless and they are dirty of blood. We can clearly see that the Turks till date staunchly are believe in racial superiority. And now let's talk a little bit about the peaceful versus the radical. There are n number of examples. I have spoken on your, I think for 4 hours we talked about Sufis and what they did. In short, here, who are Sufis? The scholars, the Muslim scholars and the Muslim historians themselves say that Prophet himself was the first Sufi. Okay, one. Ali was, the second, and who was the head or the leader of what do you say? The Sufis. Yeah. So it is absolutely clear that the Sufis participated in all the nitty-gritties of governance. They took share of loot of, and they accepted booty. They took share of booty. They accepted women as gifts. And till date, they play important role in power struggle. We absolutely know that very, very well. I will just, I will want to share a few things here with you about that. That most of these Sufis had come to India also, along with all the raiding armies. And who were these people? Since, after the initial wars, when they would be actually sitting idle, when the wars weren't happening so much after the first initial ghazwas led by the Prophet, they would be actually just hanging around, laying in wait for, around the front lines of Bharat for, another next wars, etc. And so that is the time they also met wandering sadhus, and they had a lot of interactions with them. They learned a lot of things from them. They learned, breathing exercises. Some of them copied, the Kalandars copied some of the, comfort yogis. And so there's a lot of huge data about that as well. But in short, I would just like to tell you how these people converted Hindus when they came to India. So Baba Farid converted Hindus in southern Punjab, which is now in Pakistan. Bana al-Haq, उन्होंने कन्वर्ट किया वेस्टर्न प्लेन्स के हिंदूज को. गेजू दराज ने वीवर्स ऑफ बॉम्बे प्रेसिडेंसी को कन्वर्ट किया. माबरी कंदायत ने डेक्कन के जैन्स को कन्वर्ट किया. शाहजलाल ने शाहजलाल एंड जलालुद्दीन तबरीजी, उसने ईस्ट बंगाल के हिंदूज को कन्वर्ट किया. Then how they were a part of the wars or the invasions. Bahanuddin invited Iltutmish to invade India. Ajmer Sufis ने गजनी को, मोहम्मद गजनी को invite किया, and he took a promise from them कि उसका नाम always खुतबे में पढ़ा जाएगा on the Friday खुतबा. उसके बदले में he will come and invade India. So Ahmad Sirindi ने declare किया भारत को दारुल Islam and Darul Harb both at war, and to be made an Islamic state. And he was the first one who had actually emphasized on jizya. शाह वली उल्लाह ने अब्दाली को इनवाइट किया. उसके बेटे ने बरेलवी को बनाया, और बरेलवी, he appointed बरेलवी ने about 80,000 jihadis. Mind you, in the 18th century, अगर 80,000 jihadi बनाए थे, तो what would happen? What would the numbers be with the kind of rate that they multiply in?
Dr. Elst is an Indologist and one of the few Westerners to actively defend Hinduism. A soft-spoken man, Dr. Elst is known for his blunt and objective views. He has authored 30 books and was a foreign desk press editor, a foreign policy assistant in the Belgian Senate, and a visiting professor at 2 Indian universities. Welcome, Dr. Elst. Dr. Elst, one hears a lot about the different kinds of Islam. How many kinds of Islam are there, and which are the correct ones? And
well, yes, it's a very good question. How many kinds of Islam are there? Well, you see, you have a superficial division in several tendencies like Shiism and Sunnism. But ultimately, there's only one Islam. And so there are differences about dots and commas. But the belief that Muhammad was the prophet, that the Quran is the word of God, that is common to them all. And so, as the Turkish president Recep Tayyip Erdogan has said, there is only one Islam. It is an insult. It is an insulting imposition of Western values to pretend that there are different kinds of Islam, and that one kind of Islam should be promoted over other kinds. So there really is only one Islam. Of course, there are people whose behavior, whose writings give occasion to characterizations like extremist and moderate. That is true. But if you look more closely, those are not different kinds of Islam. There is an important analytical difference, and it's very important to insist on this difference in order to understand the question correctly. Namely, the difference is not between extremist and moderate Muslims. No, it is between a strict interpretation of Islam and a weak version of Islam, where Islam is espoused in name, where lip service is paid to Islam, but in fact, many non-Islamic values are brought in. You see, why are people, for example, why are people enthusiastic about music? You see, as the earlier speaker correctly said, music is not Islamic. Just recently, the Taliban in Afghanistan have again murdered or otherwise terrorized several musicians. And so music is un-Islamic because the Prophet couldn't stand music. This probably had to do with his own neurological disorder that explains the hallucinations which he interpreted as hearing the voice of God. Now, of course, that's a deduction that we can make from Islamic scripture. None of us was present there, so this is a hypothesis. But at any rate, the Prophet disapproved of music. And so, because Islam consists essentially in imitation of the Prophet, therefore the Taliban or the Ayatollahs in Iran, all serious Muslims, disapprove of music. Music is intrinsically un-Islamic. Now, what to do with all these moderates who do practice music? And you even have specific types of Islamic music or Sufi music like Qawwali, like Sema, and so they are forms of compromise between Islam and normal human nature is naturally inclined to music, to enjoy music, to make music. And so some people born in a Muslim background still have that normal human tendency to music. So those people may, under social pressure, pay lots of emphatic lip service to Islam, but what they are actually doing is un-Islamic and remains un-Islamic. And so if I say music is un-Islamic, then of course some soft brain will come in between and say, oh, but I have a neighbor and he's a great singer and he's a fervent Muslim. Well, you see, he misunderstands. Okay, on the one hand, he may call himself a Muslim. On the other hand, to the extent that he enjoys music, he's not a Muslim, he's just a human being. So that distinction should always be carefully made. You see, this behavior, like, for instance, music, like tolerance of other religions, for example, which indeed you do find among many Indian Muslims. You see, they can perfectly tolerate having a Jain neighbor or a Sikh neighbor or whatever. That is just a human tendency. That's not Islamic. And indeed, in Islam, you have always movements to promote real Islam, to fight these soft, these humanistic tendencies. Like in India, you have the Tabligh movement. You see, as you may remember, among Hindus, there was the reform movement Arya Samaj, which was very active in what it called Shuddhi, or purification, which meant a reconversion of converts to Islam back to Hinduism, right? So And this was possible because many Muslims were only very superficially Islamized and had retained many of the Hindu customs of their ancestors. And therefore, for them, it was not a big step to reconvert to Hinduism. So in order to combat this tendency, Muslims said, well, you see, we have to Islamize the Muslims. We have to make the nominal Muslims, the Muslims in name only, more conscious of real Islam. You see, we have to not drown them, but immerse them in real Islam and make them real intolerant Muslims. So that's the Tabligh movement. Yeah, a recent leader of that was Maulana Wahiduddin Khan, whom I regret to say was very feted by Hindutva leaders. You see, thinking that, oh, if they could humor him and appease him, he would bring lots of Muslims not into Hinduism, but at least into some arrangement with the Hindu movement. So that's often, you see, this idea that soft-brained Hindus have, that if you are only nice enough to Muslims, then they will be nice to you. And so that's only true if you deal with Muslims who are not really Muslims, who have not really been immersed in Islam. But so real Islam is intolerant. Is intolerant to music, is intolerant to gestures towards the kafirs, the unbelievers, and so on. There is only one real Islam. Now, you can compare the role of real Islam in the life of ordinary Muslims to a box that is being passed on in a family from generation to generation. This box contains a poison. Now, the first generation, like let's say the first converts, who only convert under duress, under social pressure, or even under physical force, they simply convert to Islam without actually believing in it. Then their children go to the madrasas and so on. And so after a few generations, they're fully Muslim. They have completely forgotten about their non-Muslim origins. But you see, they're not really fanatical yet. But you see, this box, which is Islamic doctrine, is passed on from generation to generation. Then one day, usually a teenage boy gets enthusiastic. He gets religion, and he opens the box, and he sees what Islam really stands for, and he becomes enthusiastic for this real Islam. And so then he joins the Taliban or Boko Haram or Al-Shabaab or the Islamic State, and then you get real Islam in action. Then you get terrorism and so on. So this is not to say that there are no moderate Muslims, they are only moderate because they're to the extent that they're not Muslims. But you see, in human nature, all these strange combinations exist. So among Muslims too. So theologically, there is really no problem. Islam is Islam, and it's a very straightforward subject. You see, I myself have essentially lost interest in Islam maybe 20 years ago, simply because it's such a simple topic. You see, after a fairly short while, you have simply understood. And by the way, I am very fortunate, to see many young people like the former speaker who have delved into the subject of Islam and who are now translating this information about Islam for the present generation. So the information about Islam is available, remains available, becomes ever better available. There are websites specialized in discussing the different problems with Islam. But so ultimately, I for myself have decided, well, essentially everything about Islam has been said. Now we merely have to see what policies follow from this. And so that is more a human problem. You see, how do you tell Muslims this? I mean, you shouldn't throw them all into the Indian Ocean, of course. I don't think anybody in his right mind is saying that. But what should you do, you see? Should you prohibit Islam from being taught in school, for example? You see, that's, again, a very far-reaching step to take. Some people do advocate that. Should you rather, as I tend to say, emphasize scientific education, teaching the scientific temper, not only devoted to ridiculous superstitions, but really to the hot issues like Islam, and show the contrast between what Muslims believe and what may really have happened. You see, Muhammad did not hear the voice of God. There is nothing in the Quran that shows it to be a prophetic book dictated by some supernatural being. No, it's entirely the product of a 7th century Arab businessman. There's absolutely nothing in the Quran that goes against this. So you see, this should widely be taught. So the policy of appeasement of Islam, that is what should stop. If you treat them as normal human beings, and if you treat Islam as one of the very many doctrines that human beings have thought up, then already the most fundamental step has been made. So otherwise, you see, of course, Islamic terrorism, Islamic riots create certain practical problems. For that, you have a security apparatus. And so let them do their work. That's not my job. But the ideological job has far more importance long term. You see, if you do like for instance, the Americans after 9/11, you deploy lots of military power. Well, that has a short-term result. Can't deny that it has had some results. Like initially, they beat back the Taliban in Afghanistan. Initially. But then they did nothing of the necessary ideological work. Not as propaganda among Muslims, but especially not in their own decision centers. And so all the successive American presidents and their entourage, they have consistently cultivated misinformation about Islam. Always saying, Islam is a great religion, but the Muslims are great fools. The Muslims have misunderstood the Prophet and so on. That's all nonsense. You see, if they misunderstand the Prophet, well, that's a good thing. You see, if they take the Prophet seriously and follow his example, just like the Prophet destroyed all the statues in the Kaaba when he transformed this pagan place of pilgrimage into an Islamic place of pilgrimage. That way, all the Muslim conquerors, Aurangzeb and so on, Mahmud Ghaznavi and so on, they have destroyed Hindu temples. Or the Taliban have destroyed the Buddhas of Bamiyan and so on. That's because they take the example of the Prophet serious. So that's the real problem. If policymakers in America or indeed in India had understood that, they would have made big strides towards solving the problem. That, unfortunately, has not happened, but that's what I keep working on. Right. So essentially, to quickly answer your question, there are moderates within the Muslim world, but that is to the extent that they are not Muslims. One final comparison. The effect of alcohol on people, particularly on driving. You see, some people, they can drink themselves totally drunk and then take their car and drive home safely. Somehow they know how to pull it off. Other people, by contrast, they may have drunk very little or they may have drunk nothing at all. No matter what you do, they are a danger on the road.
That's very well said.
But between these two extremes, for most people, obviously, alcohol has a negative effect on your driving capacity. So similarly, the Islamic doctrine has a negative, a fanaticizing effect on your attitude towards other human beings. So thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Ernst, for this wonderful exposition. I really liked your take on the Arya Samaj Shuddhi movement, the Tabligis, and what you said was people simply converted without believing in Islam. I really liked your take on that. I would now like to invite Dr. Bill Warner to the panel, and I would like to introduce him before that. Dr. Bill Warner is an expert on political Islam, an international speaker, an author of nearly 30 books and courses, and a blogger. Dr. Warner founded the Center for Study of Political Islam and Center for Study of Political Islam International to further explore and educate about the Islamic ideologies and its ramifications for the Western civilization. Dr. Warner, I would like to begin by asking you what motivated you to establish CSPI and CSPII, and what is political Islam?
When I saw the second plane hit the second tower on September 11th, 2001, I knew that I lived in a nation that didn't know a Hindu from a Sikh, from a Buddhist, from anything else. And I also realized that this would be an ideological war. When on September 11th, my phone began to ring from different friends calling me and saying, "You said there was going to be a big hit. How did you know that?" I said, "Well, I read their playbook," because I'd started reading about Islam and when I was a college professor and had many Muslim students. So I'd already read the Quran, then I read Muhammad's life. So when Osama bin Laden called America to Islam, I knew that we were going to get whacked. And indeed, it was a classic. He attacked a financial center in the morning in a surprise attack, just as Muhammad preferred, after he had called them to Islam. So I made it my purpose to make the doctrine of Islam easy to read. When I say the doctrine of Islam, I mean the Quran, the Sirah, the life of Muhammad, and the Hadith, his traditions. I wanted to make all of these a source so that everyone could become their own expert. The only expert I refer to is Dr. Allah and Professor Muhammad. And that's what I teach my students. I don't teach them about experts. I teach them what Muhammad said and did and what the Quran says. I produced a Quran that's readable. So therefore, my students can discuss Islam in basics and on the basis of not what a Muslim says, particularly a moderate Muslim. They can do it on the basis of what they find in the doctrine. Now, to the point of view about what is political Islam, I read religious literature all my life. I was raised a Christian, and by the time I was 16 years old, I was teaching the adult Bible class. I've studied the Torah. I've studied some Hindu scriptures. I've studied Zen Buddhism. So religion is very important to me. Although I do not now have a religion, I think it is a good thing because it teaches morals and brings a unity to a nation if done right. So the thing that struck me when I read the Islamic doctrine for the first time was how much of it was about me and you, not about how to be a Muslim. When you read a Buddhist sutra, it becomes a doctrine that is concerned with being a better Buddhist. But over half, 51% of the Quran, Sirah, Hadith text is voted to the kafir. As a matter of fact, the word kafir is so important, I went through and counted up how many times that it's used. It's used 345 times in the Quran to designate an unbeliever. So I'm a kafir and you're a kafir. I call that part of Islam that deals with the kafir political Islam. Why do I call it political? Because it is definitely not religious. Let me give you an example between the difference between political Islam and religious Islam. In America now, it's quite common, not in America, but in Europe, it's quite common for Muslims to commandeer the street and do Friday prayers. And some people say, well, they need to do that because their God commands them to pray on Friday. The prayer is Islamic, is religious. Commandeering the street and shutting down the traffic is a political act. So we need to see that it's the political part of Islam that affects us. I could care less about the religion of Islam. I don't care if they get 72 virgins or whatever else. I simply have no care about their religion whatsoever at all, other than to say it's not attractive to me. So what's important about Islam is what it says about you and me. I'd like to add something here about what's important about what we're doing now. we are the 5% talking to ourselves, who are a member of the 5%, and what I call the 5%. One of the things that's happened in 20 years since 9/11 is that many people now know the doctrine of Islam. But I find this, the higher you go, the less they know. I literally created this rule because of talking with a general one time about political Islam. He knew absolutely nothing and didn't want to talk about it. But I found that if you talk with soldiers who had been in Iraq or Afghanistan, that they knew more about Islam than the generals did. So we're involved in an ideological war. The only way we're going to win is to convince our leadership the true nature of Islam, which everyone on this panel knows about. So what we have to do is we have to democratize our information so that everyone knows it. I, for instance, am all for Islam being taught in the schools. And when I say Islam, I mean teach them who Muhammad was, teach them what's in the Quran. Because I found that once people, and by the way, I know a Christian who has converted 2,400 Muslims to Christianity. How does he do it? He has a 2-hour method he uses in which he gets Muslims to educate themselves as to what's in the Quran and who Muhammad was. He does this in a very slow method asking of questions. This is ideological war. Now, most people don't want to know how to convert anybody. So he's been ineffective other than having personal success. But what I'm saying here is that most Muslims know nothing about Islam, and the best way to de-radicalize them, a poor term indeed, is to teach them exactly what is in the Quran. It is my experience that jihadis know the Quran very well. Jihadis understand the doctrine very well. So we need to take the knowledge that we have and make it available to all. And when I say all, in particular, our leaders. This is going to be difficult to do because in the United States, people such as myself are called racist, hater, bigot, Islamophobes. So people don't want to hear me. If I tried to speak on a college campus here in the United States, there would be, if not a riot, at least protest. The United States is slowly giving up on critical thought, which is a tragedy, because the cornerstone of our civilization is what I call the golden rule, treating others as you would be treated. And our intellectual cornerstone is critical thought. We're giving up on critical thought. Now, Muslims' civilization is based on a dualistic ethical principle. That is, you treat another Muslim as a brother, but there are 13 verses in the Quran which say that a Muslim is never a brother or a true friend of a kafir. So that's the nature of Islam, and we need to understand that. So what we have here is a lot of knowledge. We now can...
Dr. Warner?
Yes.
I would like to ask you a question which only I think you can answer very, very well. And it is this, that a non-Muslim is standing on the outside of Islam and looking in. How does one arrive at an appropriate lexicon or a terminology to define Islam?
Very important question. Very important question. Aristotle, one of the great philosophers of the West, taught that naming was one of the most powerful things you could do. For instance, we use the word terrorism. It's not terrorism, it's jihad. We shouldn't use the word terrorism because what's the difference? I could be a terrorist, but if you're a jihadist, you have an entire doctrine behind you. So therefore, it's an ideological war, and we need to deal with those who know Islam best, and they happen to be the jihadis. We need to explain to all people what the nature of Islam is and for instance, another thing we don't want to do is use modern Islam or radical Islam. You may think that cutting off people's heads is radical, or flying planes into buildings is radical, but it is not radical. It is normative. There are two kinds of Muslims, basically. When you break the Quran down into its early form, Mecca, and then the latter form, Medina, you discover that in Mecca there was no jihad. There was only argumentation. And in Medina, 24% of the Quran written in Medina is about jihad. So here we see two important things. Number one, there's a dualism. Islam always has two opinions about any subject. And people want to argue, well, which one is the right one? I say, no, it is a principle called dualism. That is, both the Meccan Quran is true and so is the Medinan Quran true. But they contradict each other, you say. That is the nature of Islam. People have tried to resolve the contradiction, and what I've done as a scientist is simply to incorporate it in and call it dualism. They're both equally true, except the latter one is stronger than the first one.
Dr. Warner, thank you so much for this wonderful addition to our knowledge of Islam today. And I would like to say that what you said is very, very true, that the prayer is religion, but commandeering the street is political. From here on, I would like to invite Sandeep Balakrishna ji. Sandeep ji, most of us are aware that nearly 500,000 girls and women were subjected to grooming by men of Pakistani origin in the United Kingdom, in places like Huddersfield, Rotherham, and even at Oxford. And it generated quite a furor amongst the public because the review report that was finally released said that the ethnicity and this kind of offense could not be connected. So in spite of tons of data, we could not pinpoint the nature of this violence and sexual and religious grooming. Can you draw parallels with conditions that are in India?
What is today known as, grooming gangs, it's nothing new. It's just a new term for a very, very old phenomenon that is, as old as Islam itself. There are two things, basically, which, Islam in its operation, in its real world operation, physical operation holds, which is also sanctified by scripture, because it's only Islam that in Islam that there's no real difference between theory and practice. Muhammad showed it through practice, and then that Quran came about. It was codified in the Quran, just to simplify it very, very compressed form. So from that perspective, it all goes back to this what is also sanctioned by the Islamic doctrine of regarding Kafir land, because the entire earth belongs to Allah, and the non-conquered part of the earth, they still haven't seen light and wisdom that only Islam can bring, which Allah can bring through the message of the so-called prophet. Is that two things are primary, which is, enough history has, there's enough historical records on that, is that land and women are prized in Islam. That is non-Muslim lands and non-Muslim women. Somebody was mentioning about, reading out from the Quran about, how women were treated as booty, then sold as slaves, and then just to multiply the fold and all that. So grooming, because today, the nature of warfare and the nature of politics itself has dramatically changed from even last 150 years. The world, somebody in the mid 19th century, if he or she were to come and live in today's world, he would find it unrecognizable. It has changed very dramatically. So you're talking about a few hundred years, at least 1,000 years. Is that the warfare, the methods, and the scripture remains the same, except that the vocabulary has changed. That you can, Pakistan or any of these Gulf countries, they can't, physically take up an army and go out and invade, do a jihad and conquer Spain or Belgium or India or something like that. It's no longer possible. So what has happened is that, what is the next best route, right? So what is known as grooming gangs is this, right? That, you usurp Kafir land and Kafir women. Now, all traditional societies, for example, traditional Christian societies, I don't think they don't exist any longer. I'm subject to correction, in the sense that which was there in medieval Europe or pre-medieval Europe. It doesn't exist anymore. So which is the only last remaining, traditional society in some form or the other? It is a Hindu society. So let's look at, the European or the Western societies, which have, largely discarded any notion of Christianity or any notion of religion, both in their politics and in their the way their society actually functions, the values they believe in, their lifestyles and everything. So they are unable to come up with, or even study at any rate, or the notion that, these grooming gangs, there is a scriptural reason they do this. That, it is drilled into them. What in India we call, the West calls it grooming gangs. Here we call it love jihad. So this is what I keep saying, and I've written fairly on multiple occasions, that for the longest time, India is the only country which has actually shown the entire world how to deal with Islam. For a simple reason, until the arrival of Mr. Mohandas Gandhi, but that's a different topic. So we have shown the world how to actually deal with Islam in a very, very highly effective way. And because India is unfortunately the biggest victim and the last survivor of Islam. None of the ancient civilizations which first came at the first contact with Islam, they were wiped out. So they there are no living beings to actually tell their tale. We continue to do that. We have that. So unfortunately, the West should be learning from, taking lessons, studying Hindu history, and especially the history of Islam in India and how we dealt with it. So these grooming gangs, all these, whatever is happening there in across Europe, Germany, Rotterdam, Netherlands, Britain, all that, if a book like Londonistan could not wake up England, nothing else can wake up. So it is scripturally sanctified, but it has taken a different form. And I suppose, that in a way that answers your question. And on, I can't, kind of resist giving this take, just adding a small point to this whole thing about moderate Islam. Salman Rushdie's apology, more than 20 or 30 years after he got the fatwa, his apology is the biggest counter to this whole myth of moderate Islam. As simple as that.
Can you elaborate on that, Sandeepji? That's a very interesting insight.
Yeah, well, for the longest time, Salman Rushdie was regarded as this icon of free speech and free expression, that he stood for this scientific temper and all that. I'm sure he does. I mean, I don't know much about it. I can't read his mind. But the point is that he was funded by the British taxpayer for more than 2 decades, all because the Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran, he put a fatwa on his head saying that, I'm going to kill you. My boys are going to kill you. They're going to do a jihad on you for writing satanic verses. Okay. And then same Salman Rushdie also said, beware of, he wrote a beautiful essay in those days, when he still had that, whatever you call his spirit, that, beware of Muhammad. He actually, be careful with Muhammad, if my memory is right. He wrote a beautiful essay. It's available on the internet, you can read it. From that to nearly 30 years later, he gave an apology to, the same clerics. Khomeini is a cleric, basically the most bigoted kind of a person you'll ever find. So he said, he didn't, obviously his apology was not directed at the cleric, but he worded it beautifully that, because I wrote this book, it has caused needless controversy, and I feel very sad and sorry for being responsible for it. This he's saying after 30 years of being under police protection funded by the taxpayers of England. So this is surrender. So if you say courage, right, you have to be courageous enough to face death. Ultimately, that's what courage means. Otherwise, it's useless, right? That no matter what danger comes, I will stick to my principles. So there, that punctures your whole thing of moderate Islam, right? Look at it in whichever way.
Sandeepji, that's a wonderful take on moderate Islam. And I would like to come back to you with another question after I have spoken to Abhas Baldaya ji, a very dynamic next speaker. Abhas ji, welcome. Abhas ji is a self-professed ex-Marxist, practicing architect, urban designer, and author. He's a part of the design team of the Namami Gange project and has authored 5 books, 2 of which are yet to be published. His latest work is an ex-communist's manifesto. Abhas ji, my question to you is, Dr. Ambedkar read political Islam very closely when he called out the Motor riots for what they were. Can you tell us more on this? And why are we in denial of Motor riots for what they were?
As far as Mr. Ambedkar is concerned and his opinion about a thing called political Islam, I would say that he had dissected the subject very clinically, and he had gone into the depth of it and what the problem was. And what really becomes very interesting is that there was a period when he was in fact considering to convert to Islam. There was a period in his life. But after 1930s, from 1940s onwards, when he came across his detailed reading of the subject, his ideas changed drastically. And if I look at the current liberal gang of India, or the way they work and the way they are very fond of using the term Islamophobe, perhaps Ambedkar would be one of the tallest Islamophobe of the current time, even bigger than Veer Savarkar. So when I was discussing the same subject with some other panelists on some news debate, I was told that, it's not of any good cause to quote or cite Mr. Ambedkar or any Besant or any particular people of that era, because it's their opinion, what they have written, and they are not the facts. But even if we keep them aside for a while, that if we keep aside that what Ambedkar said or what any Besant said or what other people were saying about the whole episode of the Moplas and whatever happened, then also the facts are very criminal in nature, because the biggest problem is that this event happened. Of course, it was a great act of criminal character upon the Hindus, but the way it was buried under the carpet of buttressed with the support of the secularism or whatever we may like to call it, it is one of the biggest crimes which has happened to the Hindus, and there can be no denial that we saw one of the worst phases. I see that the way the academic has been crushed, it is certainly a very bad phase for all of us. Now, if I just go back to, if I start looking at the numbers, that what happened and how the things were. So around 2,500 Hindus were slaughtered as per the records. These are the written records. And of course, the numbers would have been more. Around 26,000 had fled down as refugees. Around 2,500 were forcibly converted. There were sexual assault on the female, and hundreds of Hindu mandirs were destroyed completely. And what is very interesting, that these all happened in the wake of the Khilafat movement. Khilafat movement was a movement which is known as Khilafat, but actually it was a Khalifa movement. And it was a movement to safeguard the caliphate of the Ottomans. And when the whole Turkey was working very hard to throw off the caliphate, it was somewhere down in the south, not even the north, which is closer to Turkey. The Muslims were mobilized, and they were said that you are going to fight for the caliphate, and we will support you for the caliphate. And the Congress went on to support under the leadership of Mahatma Gandhi. And they were in return supposed to support us for the non-cooperation movement. So it was more like our national interest was bought at the cost of saving religious ideologies or principalities, which lies in the caliphate. Now, what is a very when we further go into the reading of the works of Dr. Ambedkar, he has given a very interesting point, that there was a case where it was said that why you guys are addressing Mahatma Gandhi as some kind of Mahatma, right? He, as per the Islamic doctrine or the Islamic ideas, he's not even supposed to be seen as Mahatma. So, in fact, the person who was, let's for a time being assume that Mahatma Gandhi had certain great reason or something, he was doing something good. But in fact, Muslims were not even open to see him as his own kith and kin, like how Ambedkar rightly said that a Muslim cannot see a Hindu as his own kith and kin, and can't see India as his own motherland. It comes, and if he's a true Muslim, it's all based on the idea of how good you are following the doctrine. So certainly, what Mahatma Gandhi was doing was not even keeping Muslims very happy to that great extent, because they had to call him Mahatma and many other things. But at the same time, what I would see that it was more a principle of al-taqiyya, which they were trying to follow. That the whole idea was to use the political Islam to the greatest force, and then ensure that the caliphate is enforced. Now, if I go back a bit to the history of who the Moplas were, so in the Malayali terms, they were the guests of the people who had come across, and perhaps they are one of the oldest the Muslims who had touched Southeast Asia. And Of course, we have certain documents which even speak about how there was an interfaith marriage. You may call it stupidity or generosity or whatever. Certainly, tolerance wouldn't be a right word. But yes, there was an interfaith marriage, and a lot of conversions also happened, which people often say there was a willful conversion and not more. But when the Europeans came into the picture, things started changing, because the Europeans certainly had a very different game plan than the Hindus, because they, of course, all the missions which were out, they had certain different purpose. Whether you read Columbus or Vasco da Gama, their purpose was definitely different, which was coming from the European Renaissance, and something more was there on the plate. And so for them, the prosperity of the Moplas was not to be seen as how the Hindus had been seen. Hindus had helped them really grow their businesses, and the business had, and there was a whole trade route between the Gulf and India where all these things were happening. But the Europeans started putting the cap, and once the Europeans started putting the cap, the Hindus didn't come to support it. And later on, after the Khilafat movement, the things got propelled. And initially, when the Hindus were also quite, and there was a factor of, definitely a factor of the operation. There was a factor of operation which they were talking about, but that also has got a different picture altogether. Initially, the Hindus were supposed to support in those rebellion, but when the atrocities started happening, like this whole whatever you call a non-cooperation or khilafat, whatever was happening in the God's own land, it was really bringing a lot of brutalities upon the Hindus. And if you just go on to read the records, it's very disheartening, because of course, from the day I have been told that Mr. Ambedkar would be having his own opinion, or any peasant would be having opinion, then I have started looking into what exactly those people have to say who face the atrocity. So there's a very interesting letter which the Rani of Nilambur wrote as a petition to the lady reading, and it has been documented in the book of Gopalan Nair, and she gives a complete detail of the atrocities. She says that, but it is possible. Is it possible that your ladyship is not fully appraised of the horrors and atrocities perpetrated by the fiendish rebels, of the many wells and tanks filled up with the mutilated but often only half-dead bodies of our nearest and dearest ones, who refused to abandon their faith of our fathers, a pregnant woman cut to pieces and left on the roadsides, and in the jungles with the unborn babe protruding from the mangled corpse of our innocent and helpless children. And there are a lot more records. There are records from the newspaper. There are documents put across by the Arya Samaji. So there's a proper documentation which really support the numbers which I spoke initially about, the mass conversions, about and very recently, while I was talking about these things with one of my colleagues at my workplace, and he told me a tale, and which I never found any records. He said that there was even incidences, and he says that his ancestors had seen those atrocities. He's from Kerala, and he says that the people who were not ready to convert easily, they were put into the boiling water, and then the skin peeled off. So the atrocities which we see there definitely is coming from certain manual, or the thing what they have, what happened centuries ago. Now, if I deviate a bit and try to really decode the idea of Islam over here, then I never see that Islam is much of a religious idea at all. So if I just go a bit into understanding of Islam, and Islam is relatively a very political in nature, because the recent discoveries or the facts which have come across are very stunning, and it really shows us that Islam was definitely formed as an idea to go more powerful than the existing Christian empire, that was the Byzantine Empire. That is the reason why Dome of Rock was also built at a certain place where it was much more higher than the Christian place. And of course, when the Kaaba shifted from places to places, this again speaks of how political it was in nature. There was nothing called any iota of spiritualism which existed there. And in fact, the creation of all the documents, whether it's hadith or like if we talk about Bin Qasim per se, because he's related to our nation, it's told that he came and attacked Sindh in 712 AD. But the first document which speaks about bin Qasim appears in 895 AD, which is happening around 180 years after he's supposed to have, the 17-year-old guy is supposed to have ravished the Sindh. So all these documents were being created under the Abbasids. And of course, it followed thereon also, and Turks did a lot of document creation. They happened to be like a war manual. The more the wars, the more the hadiths were created, more the documents and the ideas like bin Qasim was created. Because Chachnama, the document which also talks about bin Qasim, happened a lot more later. It was also commissioned around 13th century. And there's a whole narrative that there was a chain of tales which existed, and there were narrators which webbed the story, but we don't find any primary sources. So coming back to the relation with all the things what we see today or what we saw in 1921, it really boils down to the idea that Islam was certainly formed with the idea of political dominance, to throw up any ideas which seems like it can come on par with it. And that's how it draws its power. So what we saw in Mopla, or what we have been seeing thereon, is certainly coming from the idea by which it sprouted, and nothing more has changed in it.
Thank you, Abbasji, for this wonderful input. And my key takeaway from your viewpoint is that Islam is a lot more political than it's actually religious. Am I right in understanding that?
Yeah, absolutely. It is highly political.
All right. I will come back to you again with a question, Abbasji. In the meanwhile, I'd like to speak to Sandeep Balakrishnaji and Dr. Warner. And I would like them both to give me their takes on who is a dhimmi and why do we have dhimmis even in countries which have other types of constitutions, maybe codified, uncodified, unitary, federal, etc., and which are not Sharia. So why do we have dhimmis in these countries also? Why do we have Islamic apologists? Sandeepji, I would like to answer you this. I would like you to answer this first, and then I would like to request Dr. Warner to answer this question, please.
Okay. Thank you, Rinkuji. So, the last part of the question is quite interesting, that, you describe dhimmis or zimmis as Islamic apologists. But how does Islam itself defines dhimmis? For example, I'll take like I keep repeating, right? The world has to learn how to deal with Islam from India. Okay, India perhaps had the largest, the most populous number of zimmis. There were so many Hindus that, they simply couldn't convert. And even during peacetime, they refused to convert. They would, Hindus, Kafirs, whatever, dhimmis, second class or third class citizens or third rate, actually their status was slightly higher than that of slaves. The status of Hindus in a pure Islamic rule was slightly higher than that of a slave. Okay, they were merely tolerated. Hindus refused to convert, but they were subjected to all kinds of indignities. Spitting into Muslim tax collectors, spitting into Hindus' mouths, and the poor victim could not show his disgust, but he had to meekly adopt an expression of submissiveness and utter humiliation. So this was all, enough number of historical accounts are there, and Muslims themselves have written this history they gloat about these things. So these were zimmis. In other words, second class, third class, almost slaves, but they were still Hindus. They suffered, they paid their jizya, they paid all kinds of taxes, they had their lands taken away from them, but they refused to convert. So this is one part of, historically, this is what is zimmis. And even in the early part of, Islam's expansion, immediately within 40 years of Muhammad's, death, people know, it's widely known, Syria all the way up to Egypt, all the way up to Spain. They kept expanding left and right. Even there, Jews and Christians were called zimmis. So this is zimma or zimmi, second class, third class, whatever, degrading kind of a non-Muslims who were treated like this. So cut to the present time, that, the zimmis that you describe as Islamic apologists, they are anything but zimmis. historically, at least in the context of Hindu history and Islamic history of India, our Zimmis were actually, they had no other go. They did not let go of their ancestral dharma. They preferred to live and die and suffer as Hindus, no matter what these sultans called them. You call me Zimmi, you call me slave, it doesn't matter. I'm still a Hindu. Today, the class of people that, you describe as Islamic apologists, they have always existed in all societies. And more so, these are, fairly recent creations. This kind of Islamic Hindus who've become Islamic apologists, especially the worst kind of Islamic apologists here are those who, what is that called? They out Nawabify the Nawabs themselves. I mean, this has a fairly, and the greatest representative of that in recent history was Nawab Nehru or Jawaharlal Nehru. So he was an icon for all these Islamic apologists in India, basically. So, I mean, for whatever reasons, out of cowardice, out of ignorance, out of career prospects, money, whatever, these guys become, or this kind of deranged extreme leftism, lots of things make them, brazen apologists for Islam. It's largely psychological, partly to do with career prospects, several other factors. Everything other than self-respect and cultural ownership and cultural self-confidence.
Yes, thank you, Sandeepji. That was wonderful, the way you differentiated between the two categories. Lakshiji, the question is, who were the Dhimmis in the past, and do we have Dhimmis in the present? I would like to ask you that.
Like Sandeepji has explained it, totality. So I really do not need to say much about it. But nevertheless, since he's already answered it, but nevertheless, the fact of the matter is, whatever you may call us or whatever you may address us as, but the modern apologists cannot be called Dhimmis simply because they are just ignorant of the fact. They're just ignorant of the truth of Islam. They are ignorant about, it's like there's a huge difference. There is an ideology or a thought process or dharma that says, that considers the entire world as a family, as one family, and wishes, good, well for everybody. And there is this one book, which you are supposed to follow. If I follow my dharma, that is my Hindu dharma, whether I worship, whether I don't, I still remain a Hindu, right? But the one who doesn't follow the book is no more a Muslim. He's supposed to follow the book. He has to abide by the book. He has to emulate his, the Prophet. And that is what Sharia is. And that is what, so unless and until they know the difference about between both the things, both the one is a dharma, which is following the cosmic law and abiding by it, and one is just following fancies of a man who legalizes every act of cruelty, every act of whether it is the barbarity, whether it is loot, whether it is rape, whether it is murder, whether it is slavery, whatever. So unless they know the difference, so I do not feel, or I do not think that we should call them Zimmis or Dhimmis. We can just call them people who are absolutely unaware of what the truth of Islam is. And that is what I try my level best at. So maybe after you're done with somebody else, I'd like to give you a few examples from the personal experiences or the things that I've learned from my family from the 1947 horrors, as well as what Quran has to say about women in Sharia.
Meenakshi ji, you can quickly tell us about that in about 5 to 6 minutes or so, if that is enough time.
One, that my family comes from that belt. Two of my aunts who were just about 15 and 13 at that time, who had come to India at that time, I'm not getting into the stories of what they went through, what my families went through, both my father's family and my mother's family. But since they had come here and they were like, serving every day, going to the camps, the refugee camps, to serve the people with Red Cross people, to attend to the wounded and all, and the kind of stories that they talked about, the kind of victims that came, the women, how brutally they were attacked, how their body parts were cut, and how they were treated. And both of these aunts of mine, both the Masis, retired from the topmost posts, in one from the All India Institute of Medical Sciences in Delhi, and one from the Medical Sciences Hospital in Mehrauli. So we have a lot of data from that. And this, man, the man who creates this book or who creates this law, what the book says is that by the order of Allah, it is the order of Allah, when he marries 13 wives, including the wife of an adopted son, including the 9-year-old. So he is actually legalizing the lecherous behavior. He is legalizing the pedophilia. And there's another fact which most people aren't aware of. Aisha, people know of, but people aren't aware of the followers of Hassan and Hussein, who are the Shias. These boys, the Hassan and Hussein, are the sons of the Persian princess who was captured at the age of 3 and who was gifted to Ali. So he actually, as his concubine when she was just 3, so he actually followed the footsteps of his, his father-in-law. So you have chapters, verse 24 in Quran, which is chapter 4 and verse 24, which talks of muta, which is the temporary marriages. So obviously everything is legalized. Sunnis call it muta, but Sunnis call it misar, and the rest call it muta. You have examples of Zakir Naik, known to have lured women into this, the Hindu women, the poor Hindu women. You have sheikhs coming from UAE to Pakistan and, India for this, Hyderabad. Then you have, 4.34, which says that the women are inferior. Because Allah has made them so, He's given them advantage over women, and because they spend their money on her, because they have more knowledge, reason, authority, and as low and as cheap as that Prophet himself says that the best wife is the one who the moment you look at her, she will please you, and the book says that she will protect herself, her private parts to in the absence of the man, and things like these, very, very demeaning things. And then you have this, whether they're rulers or whether it is people till date actually following them. If you are aware of this, that the 9th century, there was this Abdul Rahman who had 6,000 concubines. You have Mullah Ismail of Morocco who had 4,000 in his harem, and he had 1,200 children out of them. You have, the so-called great Akbar, who had 5,000, Jahangir had 5,000, Shah Jahan had 6,000, The Ottoman sultans had till 1921 their harems full of women. You have in 1954 also, you have the Nawab of Bahawalpur Sindh who has 4,000 of them. So this modern version of grooming, or whether you call it the, using taqiyya for love jihad or whatever, it is absolutely, there's no difference in the way a Muslim thinks today. Whatever acts he does, and women, for that matter, cannot even call their polygamous husbands as cheat. That is haram. Anger, you're expressing your anger on the polygamy is haram. Marrying a non-Muslim is haram. So all this adds to the demographic changes in any part of the world. And these, invaders also, following their prophet, they captured lands, they invaded, they enslaved, people. They made them more bloodthirsty. Ye bhi records mein hai that when you capture someone, you actually make him more bloodthirsty. You say a convert is more of a Muslim than the original Muslim, So you have this huge example of this Janissary of the Ottoman Empire, which is via which they actually won the Byzantine Empire, the Constantinople. They could capture it. So they would, capture about 8-10-year-old boys and castrate them or not castrate them, and they would actually train them to be fierce jihadis, and they used the people of a land to actually defeat the people of the same land, the natives of the same land. So this is what even Firoz Shah Tughlaq did, in India. So he had about 2 lakh slave boys. So there are many such examples, it's like an endless discussion. But in my opinion, as to whatever I understood, whatever I learned, also, since we are into hotel and we have a lot of, hotel industry, we have a lot of people, a lot of Muslim, especially in Bombay, a lot of women coming to us every day for jobs, and 99.9% of them are uneducated. They're young and divorced, a mother of 2 at the age of 20. Half of them, some also burned, physically assaulted. So this is the kind of and whatever you may try, it is very difficult till you take the book out of, this is my opinion, till you take the book out of a Muslim, he will remain a Muslim because that is what he's supposed to do. And that is what his book asks him to do, to emulate or to follow the deeds, each and every act of the Prophet. If you believe him, then you are a Muslim. If you do not believe him, you are a kafir. You are in just another somebody like us. So unless they're educated and brought out of that entire thing, it's an impossible situation. And I think this has to go. The message has to go in public more and more, and the people have to be educated on what that book is, what that cult is, and what is it out to do to the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Meenakshi ji. That was very insightful, and coming out from your own experiences makes it all the more personal and very, very touching. Thank you so much. Abbas ji, I wanted to come back to you with another question here. We had spoken about the ability to voice and name categories of Islam. I want to get your input on how the left sees Islam. The doctrine of the left categorically instructs its students to allow freedom of expression, freedom of religion. And Islam demands and demands till it subjugates and conquers. Now, can you draw just 2 parallels for this encroachment of political Islam into the categories that exist in India? Very, very briefly.
So left, which really exists right now, is completely based on the doctrine of anti-majoritarianism. That is how they work. Wherever they will be, they will try to just dismantle the majoritarian idea. Because left comes from a concept of it's like an equation. That equation is that from that equation, if you remove that constant of atrocity or the class struggle, then that equation fails drastically. So for that equation to work, the class struggle needs to go on and on. So then, when the class struggle needs to go on and on, it depends on the classes which they are trying to make. Now, when it comes to India or the subcontinent per se, or rather, we should just focus on India right now. It is the Hindus who are the majority of the people, and by nature, they have been, whatever you may like to call them, docile or someone who, at least for certain centuries, have not been that reactive to the situation. That sab chalta hai wala attitude has really carried on forward. This is a truth, and there is no denial to it. I accept it completely. And when this happens, they will try to really bring down the Hindu ideas or the idea which is the majoritarianism, because they go back to the focus, their focus goes back to the cultural Marxism, or if you want to pick the deconstructivism of Derrida, which Derrida's works were more of radical Marxism, what we can say, from which the postmodernism takes a lot of clues from. So it's based on the idea of that the society is based on the customs, traditions, or created by the wealthy people. It has nothing to do with any other essence than the wealthy people or the majority of the people who really set the parameter. So for the left to work and this the class struggle to go on, this majority needs to be brought down. And in order to bring down the majority in India, it's definitely Hindus. And like Ambedkar had categorized all the dharmic faiths of India under the Hindu category that time when he put it across in the constitution. So it really affects all of them, whether it's the Buddhists, whether it's the Sikh, or each and everyone coming from the Indic faith. And then they will get onto the propagandas like it was during the CAA, isn't it, that it was said that La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah is a very secular kind of notion. So that is how the political Islam was injected into the veins of already the people who I do consider that are Dhimmis, because my understanding of Dhimmis is something very different. So they got carried away, and we saw a lot of tweets and a lot of articles and a lot of things which happened around it. So that was one of the case. Then again, you see a lot of opposition to the whole fractions of Hindutva, which comes from the so-called left. Now, if we just pick one of the peg of this whole narrative, they say Andre Tuske. Now, the people are saying that they are trying to dismantle Hindutva. Fair enough. Like many say that Hindutva is all about the Hindu nationalism. Okay, take it away. Now, but they say that we are very happy with the Hinduism because Hinduism is something which is very pluralistic and it is a very pure form of religion and whatnot. They say it's good about it when it comes to the tweets and the things. But in action, Andre Tuske goes on to write an article saying that the situation of Nirvaya and many other female in the society is as equivalent as of Draupadi. So what she did here is that she not only demonized our Shastra, that is of the Mahabharata, and how the Shastra perceive the female as, but she also showed that the Hindus by default are like that. So it is a truth that those people who want to side by the left or want to be called as a left are not even standing by the Hinduism, but their whole idea is to dismantle this idea of Hindutva. Again, if I go a bit back to the Mopla situation, it was the Mopla situation which had made Savarkar really dwell into the idea and come up with a new notion of Hindutva, which was far different than what Chandranath Basu had coined in 1892. Right? Many people, I'm very surprised that all these academicians are not even aware that Hindutva was first coined in 1892, not by Savarkar. Savarkar just popularized in a different form. So what it did, it was an opposition to the very strong world political Islam which was brewing back then. So then they said that, the Hindus need to be politically active and be united. So, and it went on and on. The prophecies of Savarkar kept on becoming truth. And right now, if you remove this quotient of Hindutva, that is when this political Islam will step in, because the Hindutva is a kind of barrier to them. And it really sets a case very right for, like, for example, we are right now, Andre Tuske is talking extensively, has been talking extensively about Aurangzeb. Now, she's a female. She talks about the atrocity by Hindus upon the female, quoting our Shastras. But she is fangirl of Aurangzeb, whose own Fatwa Alamgiri extensively talks about the sex slavery and whatnot. So even if you are a rational one, a true left one, like anti-religion or per se, then that is how you need to work on. But it's not about left or right too. They will turn into a rightist where needed. They will turn into a leftist when needed. But the whole idea is to bring down the majoritarian force which exists as a cultural safeguarder of a particular nation or a society. So this assault is this idea to go hand in hand with the Islam is in no sympathy to the Islam, because the Muslims are most persecuted by the communists. You look at the Soviet, you look at China. So that's how the case is. So we all are not living in a fool of paradise. Internet has really brought the things so open to us. A lot of texts are there. So we are completely aware of what is there on the ground.
True. That's very well said, Abhasji. And that kind of brings us to the summation of this panel also. And you've already summed it up for me. The Islamist communist jihad, you have done it so well for me. Thank you so much. So we'll just wind up this panel, and I'd say just this bit, that censoring ourselves to please the Islamists, the pro-Islamists, or the radical Islamists, or the moderate Islamists is an underhanded subversion of democracy, and an attack on free speech and jihad of the pen and the tongue, which operates through our own hands. And without free speech, you no longer have a republic or a democracy. what you have is only a tyranny. With this, I would like to wind up this panel. I would like to thank Dr. Conrad Ailes, Dr. Bill Warner, Sri Sandeep Balakrishna, Sri Abhas Madhyaji, and Sushri Meenakshi Sharanji. Thank you, organizers. Thank you so much. Namaskar. Jai Hind. Jai Bharat.